This video compares the 1995 New American Standard Bible to the 2016 English Standard Version. I'll refer to them as the NAS and the ESV. Here's an outline of the contents of the video. A more detailed listing should appear in the description of the video below. By the way, to keep this video from approaching Ben-Hur in length, I'll not describe each chart in detail. You may wish to pause the video from time to time and read the words I leave unspoken. We'll begin with some background on the two translations. This chart shows a partial family tree of descendants of the King James Version. Both the New American Standard and the English Standard Versions are descended from the American Standard Version of 1901, the ESV through an intermediary, which is the 1971 edition of the Revised Standard Version, or RSV. A few details on the history and translation philosophy for both are presented here. We just mentioned that the NAS is derived from the American Standard Version. The goal was to produce an evangelical alternative to the Revised Standard Version. The NAS was published in increments, beginning with the Gospel of John back in the 1960s. The complete Bible was finally published in 1971. It was modified a few times over the years. Most significantly, the 1995 update removed the thous and these previously used when referring to God. It also deleted a number of conjunctions and replaced some pronouns with proper names. The NAS is advertised as the most literal modern English translation. But the way I measure literalness, that isn't so, as you'll see on a subsequent chart. The NAS Old Testament is based on an earlier edition of Biblia Hebraica, and its New Testament is based on the 26th edition of the Nestle-Aland Greek text. The 26th edition is only slightly different from the latest edition, the 28th, on which the ESV New Testament is based. I'll refer to those editions as NA26 and NA28 in this video. We'll see later that the NAS New Testament actually appears closer to the 19th century Greek New Testament edition of Westcott and Hort than to NA26, based on my own admittedly limited examination. The ESV comes from the RSV. Its editors call it an essentially literal translation. That means it, quote, seeks as far as possible to reproduce the precise wording of the original text in the personal style of each Bible writer. As such, its emphasis is on word-for-word correspondence, unquote. All that said, it is, in my view, less literal than the NAS. The ESV is based on the 5th edition of the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, an edition of the Masoretic text, but the translators sometimes depart from it in favor of the Dead Sea Scrolls and ancient translations of the Hebrew Bible, like the Septuagint. The ESV's New Testament is translated from NA28, but as you'll see, the translators made their own textual choices. In a video available here on YouTube, Dr. William Muntz, famous for his textbook Basics of Biblical Greek, states that he and his father were responsible for the vast majority of differences between the RSV and the ESV. I believe he means in the New Testament. I recommend you watch that video. This chart lists well-known personalities who use or have used each translation. I haven't been able to verify every entry, and some of them are based on old data, such as books published in the 1980s, so take this list with a grain of salt. We move now to the next major bullet on the outline, general differences. The NAS has a number of features that distinguish it from the ESV, like italics for translators supplied interpretive language, capitalized pronouns when those pronouns refer to God, small capitals for text in the New Testament quoted from the Old, and an asterisk to indicate that a verb translated in the past tense is actually a present tense verb in the Greek. The ESV, on the other hand, provides footnotes to distinguish the singular you from the plural you. Both translations seem to have purged much of the rich vocabulary used in early translations. Here the NAS has at least retained the word swine, and here tongue. But in Acts 2:17, the ESV retained flesh, while the NAS went with the insipid word mankind and relegated the literal reading to a footnote. And here in Acts 13:35 it did the same thing with see corruption. I'll say this again later, but one of my major issues with the NAS is the fact that it places so many literal readings in footnotes. But to its credit, the 1995 NAS retains that quaint word brethren. I expect that to change when the next edition of the NAS is published, perhaps in 2021. It will likely replace brethren with brothers and sisters. The ESV sometimes retains the word multitude, where the NAS has crowd. I don't know what's wrong with multitude. The ESV uses election, while the NAS replaces that with phrases like his choice. I'm not sure why. Happily, both translations continue to use theological jargon like justification, sanctification, and redemption. They both use the word shall also. The informal speech mafia would like to see that word go away. Now we'll transition to a discussion of the Old Testament textual basis of the two translations. Here and throughout this video we'll compare the two translations to each other, but from time to time we'll take a backward glance and compare them to their predecessors, the American Standard Version and the Revised Standard Version. The English Standard Version relies on the Dead Sea Scrolls and ancient translations much more often than the NAS does. I examined both translations in 67 spots where the Masoretic text differs from the Dead Sea Scrolls or the ancient versions. The NAS departed from the Masoretic 9% of the time, the ESV 30% of the time. Part of the difference is due to the influence of the RSV on the ESV. The RSV often translated readings from the Septuagint, but the RSV Old Testament was published in 1952, just a few years after the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and too soon to make much use of them. So some of the Dead Sea Scroll usage in the ESV is due to the initiative of the ESV translation team itself. Our first example is Deuteronomy 32:8. The NAS reads the sons of Israel at the end of the verse, while the ESV has the sons of God. The NAS follows the Masoretic text, as you can see from the ESV's footnote. The ESV follows a Dead Sea Scroll reading here. It also agrees with the Revised Standard Version, which apparently came up with the phrase sons of God based on other sources. This chart simply identifies the Dead Sea Scroll responsible for the reading. Our next example comes from Deuteronomy 32:43. The ESV is quite a bit longer here than the NAS, since it includes the added material from the Dead Sea Scrolls shown in red. There are also a few other differences shown in blue. The NAS translates the Masoretic text and is very close to its parent here. The ESV innovated here by including the Dead Sea Scroll material that was absent from the RSV. For the record, I show here the source for bow down to him all gods. The same scroll is the source for he repays those who hate him. Here in the 144th Psalm, we see a small difference at the end of verse 2. The ESV follows a reading that is in a few Hebrew manuscripts, but also in a Dead Sea Scroll. The NAS follows the reading in the majority of Hebrew manuscripts. In doing so, it remains very close to the ASV. The ESV and the RSV agree on ending verse 2 with peoples and not my people, but the ESV differs from the RSV in a few other ways in this passage. The NAS Translation Committee in charge of revising it for 2021 does not seem inclined to make use of the Dead Sea Scrolls here. From time to time, the Lockman Foundation posts extracts from the upcoming edition of the NAS at its Facebook page. A post that included this passage left my people unchanged. Here again I identify the Dead Sea Scroll just for completeness. Here in Isaiah chapter 21 verse 8, the words in blue are just two different ways of saying the same thing. Both the NAS and the ESV are translating a Dead Sea Scroll reading, as their footnotes indicate. The NAS departs from its parent, the ASV, which translated the Masoretic texts, he cried as a lion. Another example of where the NAS follows a Dead Sea Scroll reading is in Isaiah 49:24. The RSV followed the Dead Sea Scroll reading here, even though the scrolls had only recently been discovered, but the RSV footnote attributes the reading to an unidentified source. The ESV is very close to the RSV in this passage. Here again, I identify the Dead Sea Scroll in question. The next few examples will show departures from the Masoretic text in the direction of an ancient translation like the Septuagint. In this passage, the question is whether Pharaoh made servants of his people or removed them to the cities. You can see from the footnote on the right that the ESV follows a reading present in the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, and the Vulgate. It does not follow the Hebrew or Masoretic reading, which is removed them to the cities. The NAS, following the Masoretic text, reads like the ASV, but in a footnote, the ASV mentions the reading the ESV follows. The NAS does not include a similar footnote. The ESV keeps in line with the RSV here. The RSV also followed the reading made slaves of them, present in the ancient translations. The next example comes from 1 Samuel 9:25. Did Samuel speak with Saul on the roof, or did Saul sleep there in the bed that had been prepared for him? The ESV follows the Septuagint here, while the NAS, as is usual, follows the Masoretic text. The NAS modernized the ASV a bit, replacing communed with spoke to. The ESV is even closer to the RSV. It replaced the RSV's upon with on. In passing, I note that the NAS footnote is misleading as written, since it indicates what the Greek adds, but fails to state what the Greek omits. Just to remind you, the theme of this section is that the ESV follows the Dead Sea Scrolls in ancient translations more frequently than the NAS does. In this case, we see a somewhat lengthy section of text in the ESV, which is not present in the NAS. The shorter version of the passage is based on the Masoretic text, which the NAS follows like the ASV before it. The ESV once again agrees with the RSV and inserts the material in blue from the Septuagint. The NET Bible provides a note that explains how the text may have disappeared from the Hebrew manuscripts during the copying process. In 1 Samuel 14:41, we see another instance where the ESV text is considerably longer than that printed in the NAS. The NAS is shorter because it translates the Masoretic text, which is shorter. The ESV follows the RSV's example in translating an ancient translation, in this case material from the Latin and Greek. I show here this passage in the Latin-based Douay Rheims Bible to display its similarity to the ESV. In verse 1 of Psalm 38, the ESV includes the words, O Lord, not present in the NAS, and there is no footnote. Not surprisingly, the words were supplied from the Septuagint, though they are said to be present in some Hebrew manuscripts also. In verse 13 of Psalm 145, the ESV again adds material from the Septuagint, shown here in blue. Psalm 145 is an acrostic in which each line begins with a letter from the Hebrew alphabet, but one letter is missing in most Hebrew manuscripts. It is supplied as shown in blue from the Septuagint and other sources. The NAS translates the shorter version of the psalm from the Masoretic text without the material in blue. The ESV supplied the material for the missing letter from the Septuagint as the RSV had done before it. So to sum up, we've seen one clear contrast between the two translations. The NAS, like the ASV before it, generally sticks to the Masoretic Hebrew. The ESV, on the other hand, is more willing to depart from the Masoretic text to follow readings found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and ancient translations, like the Septuagint. We'll leave the Old Testament behind now and proceed to examine differences in these two translations that are due to the fact that they start from different Greek sources. Our first example is from Mark 7:14, where you see a striking difference at the end of the passage. The ESV talks about washing dining couches, and the NAS does not. As you can see from footnote B under the NAS text, the word translated as washing is actually baptizing. As you can imagine, this passage comes up in discussions of the mode of baptism, or dining couches immersed. The NAS omits "and dining couches," and so follows the lead of the ASV. Interestingly, by omitting "and dining couches," the NAS agrees with Westcott and Hort's 19th century Greek New Testament, and it disagrees with NA 28. The ESV includes "and dining couches." In doing so, it disagrees with its predecessor, the RSV, which relegated it to a footnote. The ESV translates the NA 28 in this passage. For those interested, I mention here some of the manuscripts that weigh in on this issue. As a second example, consider Colossians 3:6, where the NAS includes "upon the sons of disobedience," but the ESV does not. Here the NAS translates the Greek text present in NA 28, and it does so in agreement with its predecessor, the ASV. By omitting "upon the sons of disobedience," the ESV follows the example of its parent, the RSV, in translating the text present in Westcott and Hort. Here again I name some of the manuscripts that weigh in on this question. It's curious that the ESV footnote refers to the majority of manuscripts with the word "some." Our third example is from Hebrews 2:7, where the NAS includes the words "and have appointed him over the works of your hands." In following the ASV's lead in including these words, the NAS agrees with Westcott and Hort, as it did in our first example. The ESV omits them in agreement with the RSV. Here the ESV follows its base text, the NA 28. Here again I name some of the manuscripts that support each reading, and point out the interesting fact that although the words "and have appointed him over the works of your hands" are not in the majority text, they are in the King James Version. The KJV is based on the so-called Textus Receptus, and this is one of the places where the Textus Receptus disagrees with the text providentially preserved in the Eastern Roman Empire. In this fourth example, the ESV mentions unclean and detestable beasts, where the NAS only speaks about unclean and hateful birds. In neglecting the beasts, the NAS agrees with the ASV and translates the text in Westcott and Hort's Greek New Testament, as it did in our first and third examples. The Revised Standard Version also omitted mention of the unclean and detestable beasts, but NA 28 includes these words, and the ESV dutifully translates NA 28 in this verse. And a few words about manuscripts and resources that give reasons for including them. The next 6 charts show some of the more interesting differences I've found between the ESV and the NAS New Testaments that are due to the fact that they translate different Greek texts. Of interest on the first chart is Matthew 12:47, which the NAS includes in the text and the ESV relegates to a footnote. The ESV text is generally longer in the verses shown on this chart. Notice here that in the NAS version of Luke 10:1, the Lord appointed 72. In the ESV's version, the Lord appointed only 70. In Romans 15:19, the ESV reads, "Spirit of God," like the King James Version. The NAS has simply "Spirit." The ASV had "Holy Spirit" at that spot. The inclusion of the word "pure" at 1 Peter 1:22 also brings the ESV closer to the KJV. Several interesting differences are displayed on this chart. The ESV has "chains of darkness" in 2 Peter 2:4 like the KJV. The NAS has "pits of darkness" like the ASV. In 2 Peter 3:10, the ESV states that the earth and its works will be exposed, while the NAS will have them be burned up, as in the older translations. And there is a rather famous difference in Jude verse 5, where the NAS reads "Lord," but the ESV has Jesus saving a people out of the land of Egypt. This chart, along with the next 2, presents the results of my comparisons of multiple English translations with various Greek New Testaments. This one shows percent agreement with NA 28 on the vertical or y-axis, and with Robinson-Pierpont's Byzantine text form on the horizontal or x-axis. The results are based on 153 locations in the New Testament where there are translatable textual variants. The ESV agrees with NA 28 more frequently than the NAS does. Neither translation agrees with the Byzantine text much more than 40% of the time. This chart again shows percentage agreement with NA28 on the y-axis, but now agreement with Westcott and Hort is displayed on the horizontal axis. The 1995 NAS has the second highest rate of agreement with Westcott and Hort I've measured. Even so, it disagrees with Westcott and Hort 30% of the time. On this chart, I display agreement with the Tyndale House Greek New Testament on the horizontal axis. Agreement rates for the ESV and the NAS are both below 55%. To learn more details, such as which verses were examined and how the translations were scored, see the video entitled A Four-Dimensional Perspective on Bible Translations at this YouTube channel. We'll shift gears now and discuss how literal the translations are. The NAS is somewhat more literal, the way I define it, but not always. We'll look at a few examples. We'll start at Romans chapter 1, verse 5 through 6, and discuss the words in blue and red. Early in the passage, both the NAS and the ESV translate the Greek word eis with to bring about. My problem with to bring about is that it seems to mark Paul's apostleship as the sole cause of the obedience of faith. Both unto, as in the ASV, and for in the KJV are better here because they are less specific. The NAS, at least, provides a better translation and a footnote. In the next verse, the NAS's among whom you also are is closer to the Greek. The ESV conveys the meaning, though it fails to include the Greek word the NAS translates as also. The final phrase is called of Jesus Christ. The ESV's to belong to, which comes from the RSV, is one likely meaning in the context, but the lack of italics prevents the reader from considering other possibilities. The next example is taken from Matthew chapter 10, verse 41. This verse contains expressions in Greek that are literally rendered in the name of. The RSV assisted the reader by interpreting the expression as because he is. In the ESV, let the RSV's interpretation stand. But because he is plainly less literal than in the name of. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 30 shows a contest between sleep and have died. The NAS is more literal here. Not only does the Greek word literally mean sleep, but it is in the present tense. The RSV introduced, and some have died, likely to explain the euphemism. The ESV allowed that translation to stand. Our fourth example comes from John's Gospel, the 12th chapter, the 16th verse. I note in passing that the ESV is easier to read in the first line because it follows the normal English word order of subject, verb, object. The NAS, in line with the ASV, mimics the Greek word order of object, word, subject. The ESV is somewhat non-literal in the way it translates the Greek verb epiesen, they had done, as if it were passive, had been done. Doing so creates a parallel between these things had been written about him and these things had been done to him, which makes for more graceful English, but it is less literal than the NAS. The ESV is similar to the RSV here. The NAS follows the ASV, which reads, and that they had done these things unto him. In the next example, taken from 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 10, the ESV is more literal. First, notice that in this verse, the NAS seems more Calvinistic than the ESV. His calling and choosing you implies that God is the one who elects the individual. The ESV's wording, taken in isolation, allows one to assume that we elect ourselves. The Greek reads as shown on the chart and may be translated literally as, therefore, brethren, be all the more diligent to make your calling and election sure. For doing these things you will not ever stumble. Compare that to the ESV's translation, and you'll see that the ESV is more literal. The NAS inserts his without the use of italics, though his is absent from the original, and it replaces your with you. Some people take offense, rightly I think, at the widely repeated criticism that the NAS is woodenly literal and features awkward readings. A champion of the NAS challenged people on Facebook to name one verse in which the NAS is more awkward than the ESV. I submitted this verse as an example. It came as no surprise to me when the NAS defender disagreed, but it seems obvious that in this instance the NAS is not only less literal than the ESV, but it is also somewhat awkward. Acts chapter 2 verse 42 provides another example of where the ESV is more literal than the NAS. As acknowledged by the NAS footnote, the prayers is more literal than to pray. It is not difficult to find examples where the ESV presents literal readings the NAS relegates to its footnotes. It's not clear why the NAS removes so many literal translations from the text. This characteristic of the NAS is troublesome, especially since some editions of the NAS omit these useful footnotes. Based on a posting at the Lockman Foundation's Facebook page, it appears that the upcoming edition of the NAS will retain the less literal to pray in the text. Of course, it's easy to cherry-pick verses where one translation is more literal than the other. This chart was based on examining translations in 200 verses chosen at random and counting what I call liberties. Example liberties are listed on the chart. As you can see, over the 200 verses I examined, the 1995 NAS was somewhat more literal than the ESV. It was less literal than the 1977 NAS, largely because it replaces pronouns like he with proper names like Jesus, and because it deletes conjunctions. One example is at Revelation chapter 13, verse 1, where the 1977 NAS has the pronoun he, which is literal. The 1995 NAS has the dragon, which is an explanation. In the next section, we'll examine the development of each translation, starting with the ASV, their most recent common ancestor. We'll also spend some time discussing the translation of the Greek imperfect tense to help understand the changes introduced by the NAS. We'll begin with the development of the ESV. Here we see the text of Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 42, along with verse 53. The text is displayed in three translations: the 1901 American Standard Version, the 1946 Revised Standard Version, and the 2016 ESV. I chose the 1946 RSV as the intermediate point because more changes were introduced between 1901 and 1946 than afterwards. Looking at the two columns to the left of the chart, we see that the RSV replaced and with now, replaced multitude with crowd, deleted a semicolon in favor of a comma, removed behold, replaced multitudes with people, replaced thronged with pressed around, and rejected laughed him to scorn in favor of laughed at him. I'm not sure why. I still hear the expression laugh to scorn. Frankly, I don't think the changes introduced in 1946 were real improvements, but I'm a dinosaur. So next, let's look at the changes that occurred over the 70 years between 1946 and 2016 in this passage. We lost another semicolon, replaced by a full stop. Besought became implored. The Greek text doesn't include the name Jesus, but using it helps resolve a possible ambiguity. The people pressed around Jesus, not Jairus. So the ESV tidied up the RSV a bit. It deleted a detestable semicolon, replaced that inscrutable word besought, and clarified a point which I doubt ever confused anyone. With that, we'll move to the evolution of the NAS. The 1901 ASV remains our starting point. In the middle is the 1963 NAS. The 1995 NAS is the end point. Like the 1946 RSV, the 1963 NAS made minor punctuation changes. It retained multitude and multitudes. The 1963 NAS retained behold, but dropped laughed him to scorn in favor of began laughing at him. Notice that capitalized pronouns for deity were already present in the 1963 edition. The 1963 NAS also replaced the ASV's were waiting, past continuous tense, with had been waiting, past perfect continuous tense. The change may be due to the fact that the Greek verb of being, eson, is in the imperfect tense, and the translators wish to express its durative sense. More significantly, in 1963, the NAS began these began to constructions with the word began in italics. If you see began to in the NAS with the word began in italics, that's a signal that they're translating the Greek imperfect tense. Sometimes you'll find began to in the NAS without italics, like in Mark 13:5. In cases like that, a Greek word corresponding to began is present in the text. If began is in italics, the translators want you to understand that the Greek verb, here to entreat or to laugh, is in the imperfect tense, and that they understand it in an inceptive sense. In my opinion, the past tense, besought, entreated, or implored, works better here than began to entreat. After all, Jairus didn't just begin to entreat Jesus, he actually entreated Jesus. The mourners didn't simply begin to laugh at the Lord, they actually laughed at him. The change from the past tense thronged to the past continuous, were pressing, is also due to a Greek verb in the imperfect tense. Here the imperfect is understood to be durative rather than inceptive. I think were pressing works well in this instance, since the thronging occurs continuously as Jesus passes. Next, let's glance at the changes between 1963 and 1995. First, the word multitude lost its place in favor of people, and multitudes became crowds. A footnote was added to explain that people really means crowd. The word behold was deleted, and entreat gave way to implore. Incidentally, all these changes in blue were introduced in the 1995 edition. And so, after that multitude of revisions, we have the two translations as they stand today. Overall, they still seem quite similar. The most significant differences involve capitalized pronouns and representations of the Greek imperfect tense. Examples of where this practice, using a continuous past tense English verb to represent a Greek verb in the imperfect tense, simply does not work well in the NAS, are easy to find. In the example from Luke chapter 6, verse 5, the Pharisees confronted the Lord after his disciples picked heads of grain on the Sabbath. He reminded them that David and his companions had eaten the consecrated bread, then concluded by asserting that he himself was Lord of the Sabbath. By translating the Greek verb elegan with the English expression was saying, the NAS gives the impression that the Lord made that assertion repeatedly in those exact words. The ESV sometimes translate the Greek imperfect tense in this way also. Mark chapter 11 verse 17 is an example. This chart summarizes my editorial comments about the NAS and the Greek imperfect tense. In the interest of time, I'll move to the next topic, gender issues, but feel free to pause the video here. Next, we'll discuss how the true translations deal with gender. My favorite passage to examine on the topic of gender inclusiveness is Revelation chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. Both the NAS and the ESV employ what I call the classic gender-inclusive pronouns him and he in this passage. When I was a little boy, I was taught English grammar in school by women, most of whom were born before the Second World War, and some of them were born before the First. They taught me that he, him, and his were shared pronouns. They could refer to boys or girls depending on the context. I still think of those pronouns and words like man and mankind in that way. The old Revised Standard Version read, he who conquers here, like the NAS. The ESV changed that to the one who conquers. Personally, I have no problem with the ESV's use of the one who conquers here, and that use is in keeping with the 1997 Colorado Spring Guidelines. The translations of these verses you'll find in the 2011 NIV and the New Revised Standard Version are much more diligent in removing grammatically masculine pronouns. The NIV uses the singular they. The next example comes from John chapter 3, verse 36. Here we see that the old RSV used he who constructions, as the NAS still does. The ESV replaced he who with whoever. Again, I have no objection to that, but the replacement does show that the ESV translators and/or editors were more sensitive to modern notions of gender inclusiveness than the NAS translators and/or editors were in the years leading up to 1995. In Romans 16:7, a name appears that could be translated as either Junius, a man's name, or Junia, a woman's name, depending on how it is accented. The NET Bible provides a useful note regarding this issue. Incidentally, the NET Bible comes down on the same side as the ESV here. The NAS goes with Junius, the masculine name, while the ESV takes the female name option, Junia. But to avoid the implication that Junia was an apostle, the ESV translates the Greek epistemi entis apostolis as well known to the apostles rather than outstanding among the apostles. Here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28, we see two examples of the ESV taking a modern rather than a classic approach to gender inclusion. The RSV had man here, like the NAS. The ESV replaced that with person. But notice that the RSV had anyone who eats in verse 29. That's the way it read back in 1946, the year Gloria Steinem turned 12. Let's look next at Luke chapter 6, verse 45. Here we see a disagreement over whether man or person is the best English word to use in the first sentence. We also encounter more pronoun replacements. The Greek word the NAS translates as man and the ESV translates as person is anthropos, which means man. Just as in the pre-1970s English, it sometimes refers to females also. The ESV has a tendency to avoid that gender-inclusive use of man, and so it employs person instead. But notice that the ESV has no issue with continuing to use the pronoun his in a gender-inclusive way. We'll move next to Matthew chapter 19, verse 26. Here the ESV has man, while the NAS goes with people, which is rather different from what we've come to expect. The Greek word translated people and man here is anthropis. It's a plural form of the word man. The 1963 through 1977 NAS editions had men here. People was introduced in 1995. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, we continue the controversy between man and people. As shown in blue in verses 15 and 16, the NAS retains the use of the word men in its classic gender-inclusive sense, while the ESV prefers people. In verse 17, the old ASV had honor all men. The NAS continued to read men at that point until the 1995 revision. In my view, replacing men with people is not controversial there. Perhaps people should be in italics. The RSV had men in both places in verses 15 and 16, where the ESV reads people, and it had honor all men in verse 17, even though the word men doesn't appear in Greek. Glancing ahead at the upcoming revision of the NAS, it appears likely that the NAS will replace men with people in this passage. It also intends to ditch bond slaves in favor of bond servants. Finally, notice that both the NAS and the ESV translates tin adelphantita as the brotherhood. As far as I can tell, the 2020 NAS also intends to retain brotherhood here. More boldly gender-inclusive translations like the 2011 NIV and then the NRSV replaced the brotherhood with the family of believers. We'll back up to Romans chapter 1, verse 13. The NAS follows the ASV in employing the word brethren here. The RSV also had brethren, but the ESV modernized that to brothers. According to the second edition of Bauer's Lexicon, 1979, the ESV's footnote here is accurate. The plural adelphi can indeed mean brothers and sisters. It appears that the next edition of the NAS will drop brethren in favor of brothers and sisters. Assuming that Paul meant to address both male and female members of the church in Rome, my only difficulty with brothers and sisters is that and sisters is italicized. If adelphi means brothers and sisters here, the italics are not needed. But I think a comma is needed after also. Now we move to other comparisons that interest me. I've arranged them under three headings. First, general differences. Second, interpretive insertions and the use of the italic font. And third, plural pronouns. So we'll move along to an examination of general differences, starting in John chapter 1, verse 18. Both the NAS and the ESV translate a Greek text that includes the word God. Many of the older translations were working from a text that included the word Son, so they read only begotten Son, like the KJV, or only Son, like the RSV, instead of only begotten God. The NAS and the ESV differ in the way they translate the Greek word monogenes. The NAS takes it to mean only begotten, while the ESV, like the RSV before it, translates it as only. I'm not a philologist, just a Bible reviewer, so I depend on lexicons. Bauer gives unique or only as the primary meaning of monogenes, but he also notes that some experts lean toward only begotten. According to a post at the Lockman Foundation's Facebook page, this verse will read as follows in the 2020 edition of the NAS. No one has seen God at any time. God the only Son, who is in the arms of the Father, he has explained him. It appears that the 2020 NAS arrives at God the only Son by translating monogenes as only Son, which is what it appears to mean in John 1:14. The New Revised Standard Version also reads God the only Son. Both the NAS and the ESV's parent, the RSV, have in the bosom of the Father at the end of the verse. Sadly, the ESV replaced this literal rendering with at the Father's side. Changes like this may be why I've never been able to love the ESV. But it isn't all good news for the NAS. You may have noticed on that last chart that the next edition of the NAS will replace in the bosom of the Father with in the arms of the Father. Our second stop is at Titus chapter 2, verse 13. The first hour is missing from the Greek, but and is present. In both these instances, the NAS is more literal. Both translations affirm the deity of Christ at the end of the verse, in accordance with the Granville-Sharp rule, but the NAS provides a different view in its footnote. The next comparison, at Romans chapter 9, verse 5, is also on the theme of Christ's deity. First, note that the phrase from whom in the NAS is more literal than the ESV's from their race. The translation from their race is a slight adjustment to the RSV's of their race. At the end of the verse, the ESV provides a translation that clearly supports the deity of Christ. Here the ESV is markedly different from the RSV. The RSV read, according to the flesh is the Christ, full stop. God who is over all be blessed forever. Amen. As if Paul changed subjects after mentioning Christ. In my view, the ESV more clearly proclaims Christ's deity in this verse than the NAS does. The two translations are identical in the highlighted words in this chart, so why am I showing it? Because in my opinion, both translations need to include an explanatory footnote at this point. The Greek phrase is literally by faith of Jesus Christ. A literal rendering like that in the KJV permits the reader to decide whether that means by faith in Jesus Christ or by Jesus Christ's own faithfulness. Both the NAS and the ESV assume that by faith in Christ is intended. Neither as much as supplies a hint to let the reader know that there's another way to understand that expression. The NET Bible reads, the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. It has a footnote that explains why. Sometimes when we make changes, we make mistakes. There may be a few such mistakes in this video. I want to point out that a mistake was made in the footnote to the left during the 1995 revision. Reading the footnote as it stands on the lower left-hand part of this chart, we might think that the verse literally reads, "But the Scripture has shut up things under sin." We know that can't be right. Here's what went wrong. The 1977 NAS read, "But the Scripture has shut up all men under sin." And it added a footnote to explain that, rendered literally, men is actually things. The 1995 edition removed the word men. It replaced all men with everyone, but it neglected to alter the footnote to read literally all things. Incidentally, the Greek phrase translated everyone in the NAS is tapanta. The ESV's everything is more literal than the NAS's everyone, as the footnote in the NAS, when it is eventually corrected, will show. Incidentally, the next revision of the NAS is supposed to replace shut up with confined. I hope they repair the footnote. We'll see. A lengthier passage here in Ephesians chapter 1. The NAS translates the Greek word eis as "with a view to" twice in this short section of the text. The old ASV had "unto" in these spots. The translation "with a view to" has always struck me as clumsy. Happily, the upcoming 2020 edition of the NAS will remove these "with a view to's." They'll be replaced by "regarding" and "in regard to." The NAS and ESV are significantly different near the end of verse 14. The Greek is terse and, as the ESV footnote points out, can be read in two ways. A relatively literal translation is, "who is a pledge of our inheritance unto redemption of the possession." Next we move to Colossians chapter 1, verse 29. Here I want to point out what I see as an ambiguity in the ESV. In verse 29, the RSV read, "striving with all the energy that he mightily inspires within me." The ESV replaced striving with struggling, perhaps to improve readability. But in doing so, it made the passage ambiguous, because struggling with can mean either struggling in cooperation with or struggling against. If I struggle with insomnia, that doesn't mean that insomnia and I are allies. Looking earlier in the verse, it's clear that we could have placed this example in the gender section of the video. The NAS reads man, the ESV person, as we've come to expect. With that, we end the section on general differences and move on to italics. This first example, taken from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 and 19, will give you an idea of what I have in mind. Notice the word now in blue at the end of the verse. By inserting now, it seems to me that the NAS is privileging interpretations of this passage that view the proclamation as having been made to the spirits before they entered prison, perhaps while they were still alive. The ESV and most translations avoid that bias. Happily, because the word is in italics, we know we can safely ignore it. In passing, I'll draw your attention to a difference in the first line that's due to the fact that the NAS and the ESV are translating different source texts. And as we've come to expect, the NAS agrees with Westcott and Hort, the ESV with an A28. We move now to 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 6. This passage may or may not be related to the one we just discussed. Commentators differ. At any rate, it addresses a similar topic. Uncharacteristically, the NAS inserts an interpretive footnote. That footnote explains that the gospel was preached to people who are now dead, not to dead people. I would have preferred it had the NAS editors left that sort of interpretation to the commentaries and study Bibles. Now, let's take a look at the end of the verse, since the two translations differ there. A literal translation would read, "For unto this also was the gospel proclaimed to the dead, so that they may be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit." The ESV avoids the word men, and it provides an explanation for what is meant by according to men and according to God that preserves the parallel construction present in the Greek. The NAS obscures the parallel construction and inserts the will of in italics. Since the words are in italics, we know that they provide the translator's explanation, and we can safely ignore them. With the ESV, the reader can't know how interpretive the translation is unless he or she consults the Greek, other translations, or a good commentary. In Romans chapter 1, verse 9, the NAS inserts an expression that I believe is unnecessary and potentially misleading, but at least, again, it's in italics. Those words are preaching of the, shown here in blue. Paul says that he serves God in his Spirit in the gospel. He doesn't restrict that to the preaching of the gospel, as the inserted words imply. A post at the Lockman Foundation's Facebook page indicates that the next edition of the NAS will continue to include the words in blue. So in those examples, the NAS inserted something, whether in italic font or in a footnote, which I wish they hadn't inserted. But at least the insertions in italic font are in italic font, so the reader can spot them. In this example, taken from Revelation chapter 14, verse 12, I wish the ESV had used a special font to mark interpretive words inserted by the translators. Translated literally, this verse reads, "Here is the endurance of the saints, those keeping the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." So a call for isn't in the original language. It's an interpretation on the part of the translators. But because the ESV doesn't use a special font for explanatory language, the reader is not aware and may confuse the translator's explanation with what was actually written. Looking at the end of the verse, we see that both translations depart from the literal sense. Happily, both provide informative footnotes. Another place where the ESV would benefit from the use of italics is Galatians chapter 5, verse 6. The word only is an insertion. In Romans chapter 5, verse 9, both the NAS and the ESV insert the words of God into the text. Since it doesn't use italic font, the ESV misleads the reader into thinking of God represents something in the Greek. It does not. But by placing of God in italic font, the NAS permits the reader to consider other possibilities. Both the NAS and the ESV are like their parent translations in this passage. The ESV replaced the RSV's "we are now justified" with "we have now been justified." I checked to see if other translations inserted of God. To save time, I'll let you pause the video to read the chart if you're interested. Our final example on the use of italics comes from Paul's first letter to Timothy, chapter 4, verse 13. The ASV, parent to the NAS and grandparent to the ESV, provides a literal translation, "Till I come, give heed to reading, to exhortation, to teaching." The NAS made the interpretive insertions in italics in its 1963 edition. Since they are in italics, the reader understands that they are an explanation supplied by the translator. The ESV, on the other hand, gives the reader no hint that those words are not in the original. Public reading may have been in Paul's mind, but the Greek word he used for reading is anagnosis. The word means reading, whether public or private. St. John Chrysostom, who certainly knew Greek, commented as follows: "Even Timothy is commanded to apply to reading. Let us then be instructed not to neglect the study of the sacred writings." To him, the key message conveyed was reading to study. It's difficult to imagine what written works apart from Scripture Paul may have wished Timothy to read, but in my opinion, interpretations like these are better left to the commentaries. So in keeping with our theme, let me say that the ESV would benefit from the use of italic font here to mark translator-supplied explanations. I wish the RSV, the ESV's immediate predecessor, had also employed italic font. By the way, the NAS should have placed the word "and" in italics also. Our final subtopic, under the general heading of Other Noteworthy Differences, deals with the way the two translations deal with the plural pronoun you. In 21st century English, we can't distinguish between you singular and you plural, except by context. The older translations didn't have that problem, since they used different words like thee and ye for the singular and plural. Our first example is from John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 51. In the verses immediately preceding John 1:51, Jesus and Nathanael have been speaking to each other, but here, while continuing to speak to Nathanael, Jesus begins to address a larger group. The difference is hidden in the NAS, but the ESV adds a footnote to highlight the change. Note, however, that the NAS provides a different insight into the underlying Greek, one hidden in the ESV. The NAS marks with an asterisk Greek verbs that are historical presents, but which have been translated with an English past tense to conform to modern usage. In this case, a literal translation would be, he says. Compare the KJV. A second example is located in Acts, the 5th chapter, verses 8 and 9. The ESV places a footnote beside the first you because we expect it to be singular, since Peter is addressing Sapphira alone. For the second you, the ESV editors may have thought the context, agreed together, was sufficient for the reader to understand that the word you is plural there. The NAS does not tell the reader that either pronoun is plural. Before we leave, notice that the footnotes in the NAS say that the ESV is more literal when it uses the phrase, for so much, rather than for such and such a price, or that was the price. For our final example on the topic of plural pronouns, we move to Luke chapter 22, verses 31 and 32. The ESV marks the change from plural to singular in this passage with the footnote to the right. But a person reading the NAS without access to the Greek will likely be unaware of the change. By the way, the plural you in verse 31 is actually present in the Greek only once, as shown in the NAS. Here's the way this passage reads in the KJV. The shift from plural to singular there is obvious. There are other things a person should consider when choosing a translation. I'll touch on a few of them next. The cross-reference set may be important to you. The NAS advertises 95,000 cross-references, while the ESV says it provides 80,000. I didn't take the time to count them, but I did a spot check in Isaiah chapter 1 and Romans chapter 1. My results are shown on this chart. The totals seem not to disagree with the advertised numbers. Certainly the NAS has more references than the ESV in these two chapters. If you're like me, you want to know about variant readings in the text, and you'd like to know if the passage you're reading can be translated differently. So I spot-checked text and translation notes in the two translations also. Here I looked at Isaiah chapter 1 again, but I added the entire book of Romans. I didn't have time to score the entire book of Isaiah and also make this video. The results are shown here. In a nutshell, the ESV and the NAS print about the same number of text notes, notes that tell you about variant readings in the text. The NAS gives you many more translation notes. In my opinion, many of the NAS translation notes display literal readings that should have been in the text in the first place. A few other things to consider are shown on this chart. The ESV gives you more variety to choose from. If you consider the deuterocanonical books part of the Scriptures, or if, like me, you come from a tradition that encourages reading them even if they aren't Scripture, be aware that the deuterocanonical books are available in the ESV. In fact, the Augustine Bible was published at the end of 2019, I think, and it features a Catholic edition of the ESV. The Anglican Church in North America also makes available an edition of the ESV that includes the deuterocanonical books. Copies of the ESV in verse-by-verse format are somewhat hard to come by, especially inexpensive editions. The NAS has suffered from poor quality editions in recent years, but that may have changed with the recent comfort print editions from Zondervan. The NAS is being revised, as we've seen repeatedly. Perhaps as early as the spring of 2021, a new edition of the NAS will be published. Fortunately, the 1995 edition, the one we've discussed in this video, should still be available for a time. Personally, I wish the 1977 edition were also still widely available in multitudes of editions. I'm not going to say which of these translations I prefer. As a primary translation, both are better, in my opinion, than a number of bland, uninspiring translations in informal English that are popular these days. But if it were up to me, I would change the ESV as follows. Introduce italic font for translator-supplied explanatory language. Bring back pithy vocabulary and expressions that earlier editors have deleted. I realize that this is opposite to the zeitgeist. For instance, I would go back to the RSVs. Think not that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. The ESV has do not think, which strikes me as vanilla by comparison. Insert more translation notes. Make more verse-by-verse editions available. Improve the quality of the typeface and paper to keep up with Nelson and Zondervan. Since Crossway also publishes the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, perhaps they should base the ESV's New Testament on it. I would also like to see a more aggressive use of the Dead Sea Scrolls and ancient versions in the Old Testament. How would I improve the NAS? As I mentioned before, I would move many literal readings from the footnotes to the text. I think that change alone would give the NAS more character, make it seem less prosaic, academic, and clinical. As with the ESV, I would restore much of the older biblical vocabulary and forms of expression. I would alter the way the Greek imperfect tense is translated, as I described on an earlier chart. I would repair a number of specific translations, some of which we've seen earlier. And I would, at a minimum, introduce more notes into the Old Testament to inform the reader of alternative readings from the Dead Sea Scrolls and ancient versions. One more chart and we're done. We'll finish with this summary comparison chart. I'll not read it to you, but I do want to let you know that MOD period means moderate. Please pause the video to examine the chart in detail. Thank you for your time. And please like the video, share it with your friends and colleagues, and subscribe to the channel.